to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the criminal networks in Northern Africa and the Middle East and in other parts of the world. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Phil Williams is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh, where he taught from January of 1990 to April 2022. In the first part of his career, he wrote books on crisis management, the Senate, and the U.S. troops in Europe. During the last 30 years, his research has focused primarily on transnational organized crime. His most recent book is The Mediterranean Connection, Criminal Networks, and Illicit Economies in Northern Africa. Dr. Phil Williams, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here.
Oh, I appreciate you being with me today. This is such a huge topic, and it seems to be one that's expanding around the world, not just in that one area. But one aspect of your book that I found very interesting, you talked about the smuggler's toolkit, concealment, deception, circumvention, and facilitation. Briefly, in a minute or so, how do they all work together?
Okay, let me just, Bill, can I step back a moment just to see how I got into this?
Yes,
so,
please.
As you said, the first part of my career, I was talking about traditional security problems and challenges. And then the wall came down. My wife said, you need a new topic. And I floundered for a few years in the early 90s in Pittsburgh, but then became very interested in the role of the military in the drug war. And then somebody said, the drug business is a business and the military is not a good way to deal with it. And in some ways, I think that was absolutely correct. So I became interested in the firms within the drug business, and they were criminal organizations. And they expanded greatly and have done since the 1970s, but also particularly in the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we had globalization. And this gave transnational organized crime a global hold, if you like. It became a global influence. And no area is exempt. Some areas are particularly pronounced criminal organizations, Central America, for example, Colombia, Mexico, and North Africa is one. Not as pronounced as, say, Central America, but still have major problems across the region. So to turn to the smuggler's toolkit, there are ways of getting into and out of countries. And I like this formulation. I think it's a particularly useful one in terms of understanding the variety of tactics that criminals can use or smugglers can use. So it's interesting, in the region we're talking about, the Mediterranean connection, you have lots of ports. And historically, ports have been particularly useful and particular incubators for organized crime, right? Chicago's a port, New York, Los Angeles in the United States, Shanghai, Naples, all are ports that organized crime tends to congregate in. So the toolkit itself, four things. Concealment, very obvious. You try to conceal. The Cali drug trafficking organizations in the 90s, very good at this. They would conceal cocaine in fence posts. They would impregnate it in cardboard or leather, and then it would be extracted at the other end. So that's concealment. Deception, often providing wrong papers, or again, linked with concealment. What goes in as fruit might actually have, or cans of fruit might actually, again, have cocaine in it. Circumvention, you don't come through the ports of entry, you go round, you smuggle across yourself as well as your commodities across the border. And then facilitation, basically bribery and corruption. And that exists even on the US Southwest border. We don't like to talk about it, but it's there.
Exactly. It certainly is. Yes. That's an area that's of interest. So often migrants get blamed for a lot of the criminal activities. And in most areas, excuse me, they really are not, as I read about them anyway, they're not involved in this at all. It's mostly on the southern border in the United States. It's mostly Americans and Mexicans who are involved in the drug traffic and fentanyl and that type of thing. Is that true?
That's right. I mean, migrants occasionally will be harnessed in a sense to smuggle, but a lot of the time it comes through drug smugglers using trucks, cars, and as you say, with fentanyl, it's become much easier because the quantities are much smaller. I like to say we've gone from containers to UPS and FedEx.
UPS. I'm sure UPS will be happy to hear that.
So
Uh, no, I understand what you're saying. They upgrade, they perfect their technology, shall we say, as far as doing some illegal activities. But well, let's just talk for a few moments about Northern Africa, the Middle East, whatever, whichever area you want to. And there are things that you mentioned in your book, maybe you could elaborate on. One's push and pull factors, and the other is the space of flows. What exactly do those mean?
well, I think first of all, I think it's important to locate North Africa as both African and Mediterranean.
Right.
And then
MENA.
when you
Yes.
start thinking about the Mediterranean, you also start thinking about Southern Europe, and you have
Mhm.
Spain, Italy, and Turkey are really hubs of organized crime in a variety of ways. And then there's a mini hub in the mini hub is actually in Malta. And those hubs are very important and have an influence. And some of the things I'll talk about as we go along will include, for example, toxic waste disposal coming from Italy to Tunisia in particular. So I think you have those hubs. Then I think the space of flows, in a sense, comes from those hubs. Um, and one of the biggest flows is, of course, migrants. And we forget much of the time that most migrants end up in a country close to their country of origin. And there are way more migrants in Africa than there are in Europe, much as we don't like to acknowledge that. Um, but I think also Europe, in a sense, has needed young people. And that's why Germany, at least initially, was quite happy to welcome migrants, both legal and illegal, because it gave new impetus to the economy and helped to balance out an aging population. So but the space of flows can involve a variety of goods and services and a variety of commodities, and also involves people. And with human smuggling, there's an important distinction that I want to make between human smuggling and human trafficking. Human smuggling is a crime against the state, but people are smuggled voluntarily because they want a better life. Human trafficking, or they're trying to escape from something, poverty, violence, and so on. Human trafficking is a crime against the person and involves exploitation.
And it's usually against that person's will.
That's right. They can be deceived, they can be coerced, but it is against their will. And one of the problems is that when you're being smuggled, you're very vulnerable to that being transformed into being trafficked.
Exactly. Yes, most assuredly, no doubt about it. Yes. Well, this whole thing is such a major issue and a major problem. Now, one group that's been very involved in transnational crime and what have you has been the United Nations. They've held conferences. They've got task forces. They got the ODC, the Office for Drugs and Crime. What role can they play, along with other groups, governmental groups, Interpol, and different ones like that, to
They,
overcome these problems?
they play an important supplementary role. I first started work on this in the early 90s, and with an Italian colleague, Ernesto Savona, we wrote the background papers for the World Ministerial Conference on Transnational Organized Crime that was held in Naples in 1994. And that led subsequently to the convention, often known as the Palermo Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So the UN does play an important role. Unfortunately, there are so many opportunities, and particularly in South Africa. And you mentioned the space of flows. What's interesting about those opportunities, they go in all directions. A lot of things come north from Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa, but then some things come south. Some drugs come from Holland, for example, from the Netherlands, for example. And then other things, cigarettes come from the United Arab Emirates right across Northern Africa, but many then are diverted from Algeria to France and Spain.
Exactly. Yeah, certainly it's a real myriad of goods and services being provided. Well, we're going to come back in just a moment to talk about them in greater detail. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station or an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our shows and you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at transnational crimes and illegal activities from various countries of the world that are going on. And my guest today is an expert on these topics. Dr. Phil Williams is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh. His most recent book is The Mediterranean Connection, Criminal Networks, and Illicit Economies in North Africa. This is such a potpourri of activities and areas of the world. What do you see as the most significant areas right now? I guess it's hard to really pinpoint them, isn't it? I mean, there's so many activities taking place in the Middle East, Northern Africa, called MENA. But what do you see as some of the thorniest issues for the United Nations, Interpol, and the governments to deal with?
I think at the end of the day, the biggest problems are to do with poor governance. But I do think that each of these countries has significant organized crime problem, and they differ significantly, right? So some countries focus on some things and have different kinds of illicit economies than others. Mm-hmm. Morocco, the focus is very much on drugs. But one other thing worth mentioning in Morocco is illegal sand extraction and export.
Sand extraction.
Sand. Morocco excavates about 30 million tons of sand a year, and about 15 million of that is illegally excavated. And much of that then goes to Spain for construction along the Spanish Riviera.
Which is a fast-growing area.
That's right. But for the drugs, it's also a mixture, right? There's cannabis, although production is now legalized. And in 2024, Morocco produced 4,000 tons of legal cannabis that was legally produced in the Rif Mountains in the northern part. In the past, this has been all illegal, but tacitly accepted because it was the form of the economy in the Rif, in that poor region. The other drug you're seeing is cocaine, which comes into West Africa from Latin America and then up through into Morocco and from there into Europe, although there's also a growing domestic market. Morocco also has this problem with a drug called kakoubi, which is a mix of hashish, amphetamines, and sometimes glue or even alcohol. And that tends to create hallucinations and makes people very violent. The other thing I'd say about Morocco is human smuggling is obviously big, but there's an interesting trend. In Europe, the press never talks about human smugglers, they talk about human traffickers, which is, for the most part, a misnomer. They are smugglers because the people want to come into European countries. But one thing we've been interestingly seeing in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia to an extent, is a trend towards self-organization, where they still hire the fishermen, but they do all the preparation work, the groups of migrants themselves. So that's an interesting one, and just doesn't fit the common narrative about human trafficking.
Exactly.
So that's Morocco. Shall I move through the other countries, Bill?
Yeah, sure. Please. That's a good idea. Do this briefly. Sure.
Okay, Algeria, again, a focus on human smuggling. Um, and Algeria has taken a very hard line on this in recent years. A lot of migrants are sent back, often sent out in the desert, told there's a town 12 miles that way, and they have very little water and food. Um, so you really have a problem there. At the same time, many Algerian fishermen have now gone into the human smuggling business. So human smuggling is a biggie. Another biggie in Algeria is cigarette smuggling. This comes from the Jebel Ali Free Trade Zone in the United Arab Emirates, where they have 10 factories and they produce 63 billion cigarettes a year. And they come into Algeria and, as I said, then go north. And the third element to emphasize, I think, in Algeria is their oil company, Sonatrach, because it keeps having corruption scandal so after one another. It just keeps having them. They've taken some measures to try to tamp that down a little bit, but it continues to be a problem. Tunisia, I would say it's a bit different. There's a huge gap between the prosperity along the coast of Tunisia and the hinterlands. And that has led to a lot of contraband smuggling, especially oil from Algeria. And in some ways, the Algerians have been subsidizing Tunisia by allowing this trade to go on. Because Tunisia, I think, has a lot of economic problems. It's also received toxic waste from Italy in a scheme that involved Tunisian politicians. And on the other end, the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian mafia, was involved. But perhaps most striking and sad for Tunisia has been the return to authoritarianism under President Said. Remember that for a while, Tunisia was the model for the Arab Spring. It was the poster boy, but the poster boy has not aged well. And we've seen this president increase power, again using illegal immigration as a tool to consolidate his own power. And I think that sounds familiar even to what's happening now, I think, in the US in many ways.
Mhm.
So then you've got Libya, which is very different because you have a war economy, because you've had a civil war. But oil smuggling was one of the biggies, particularly from 2013 to about 2020. And it was fascinating because a lot of that oil was being smuggled by a network that included a militia leader, Fahmy Ben Khalifa, a guy who'd been a soccer international for Malta, Darren De Bono, and a Maltese businessman, Gordon De Bono, no relation, who had a set of Ferraris that he had built. And they were involved, and there was an Italian was also involved, who was linked to Italian organized crime. And they smuggled tons of oil. They smuggled lots of oil, lots of barrels of oil in. The ships would turn off their transponder, go to Libya, load up, and then come back and either bring it directly into Malta or the Herd Bank. There was a lot then of paperwork that was done to make it seem legitimate, and then it was sold to the rest of Europe. So that was one of the key themes to come out of Libya. Again, oil as a commodity, rather like Iraq, where a lot of it, after the US went in 2003, a lot of oil was stolen and smuggled out. Egypt, I think, has its own set of problems. Obviously, antiquities, where archaeological sites, warehouses, and even museums have been looted. And it's been assessed that since 2011, somewhere between $3 and $6 billion worth of antiquities have been smuggled out of the country. The other very distinctive element in Egypt is organ trafficking. A scholar called Sean Colum wrote a brilliant book on this. And what he found was that a lot of this was organized by hospitals and clinics and corrupt officials. And they had brokers who would go out and find victims or organ donors, or whatever you want to call them, and they would be paid to donate a kidney. That changed in 2020 when Colin went back and looked at it again. He found that immigrants were being brought into the country specifically for kidney transplants, and this was no longer voluntary. For many of them, they were having to do it whether they liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
So each country has its own variation on which illicit economy is there and is dominant.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the conclusions for the book was that the real issue, as I said earlier, is not so much organized crime, with the exception of Libya, where organized crime is related to the civil war. And so you have war economies on all sides. But I think apart from that, the real problem is inadequate or corrupt governance. And we see that in all the countries. I think Morocco, least of all, where you have a king who is in many ways very monarchical and traditional, but is also very innovative and has moved, for example, into sustainable energy and is moving the country big time into that. And that can only be good. But with the exception of King Mohammed, I think in the other countries, we have very authoritarian leadership. We've gone from Mubarak to al-Sisi, but there's really no difference. We just replaced one military dictator by another. In Algeria, it's also military dictatorship, but it's behind the facade of a political front.
Exactly. You know, Phil, as you were going through that list, and thank you, that was very good, a good overview. I was thinking you have made a compelling argument for why the countries of the world need to work with the United Nations and other groups together, because they will not defeat this problem by themselves. There is no way they're going to get these drug smugglers under control without some type of international cooperation. And in fact, you could take that argument one step further as to why the United States and other countries, developed countries, should have strong AID programs, because if you can go into these countries to build friendships and to help people get an education, to start a business, to get themselves out of poverty, they don't have to revert to go into human trafficking or whatever the case might be, or go into some type of terrorist activity. You just made a compelling argument for why we need a very strong AID program, not with just the United States, but the other developed countries of the world. And most of the developed countries do have good functioning AID programs. Did I misinterpret that?
No, I think, Bill, you're absolutely right. And I see this as a travesty in many ways, what's been done to AID. There was some waste, there was some corruption, but these are minimal, and that's been overlooked, and there's all sorts of nonsense being talked. On the other side, I say the UN is very important, Interpol, but also there's an organization, it's an NGO, and it's a network called Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And we drew on that for this study a lot. It's based in Geneva. It's run by Mark Shaw and Tuesday Rotano, who were both at the UN, worked for UN Office of Drugs and Crime. And they're brilliant. They do some excellent work. I had the privilege of working for them last year and produced a paper on the future of organized crime, looking to 2040. And I think there's a new wave coming where organized crime will exploit emerging technologies. It will exploit both the manifestations of climate change and the efforts to combat climate change. It will exploit those. And it's got some massive new opportunities coming. It will also increasingly provide governance, because in so many countries of the world, governance is so poor and inadequate that organized crime finds itself providing alternative governance. And that's far from ideal, but it's probably better for most people than no governance or state governance that's 1,000 miles away.
Exactly. And we're seeing that right now. The United States had a relatively strong Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for decades, and Donald Trump got rid of it arbitrarily, just summarily knocked it out. And that now opens the door to American businesses to get involved in bribing companies overseas, governments overseas. And there's also a move in this country for this wide open laissez-faire. Let's get rid of all regulations. We're going to see much more corruption and criminality when this happens. And you can see it right now. We just started it, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. But in the last 30 seconds, what recommendations would you have to the viewers as to what we need to do?
I think we need to accept in some ways that so long as there are gaps in governance, organized crime will step in. We need to be thinking more about combating that. We need to be thinking about rolling it back wherever we can by providing good governance. And I mentioned the Global Initiative. They have an index now that people should look. It's a brilliant source of information and analysis on organized crime. They have a global index that ranks countries about how much organized crime they have, what kinds. And I think in over 100 countries, there is state-embedded organized crime. And that tells you a lot. And as you said, with the kind of the policy the US is now taking and its abandonment of anti-corruption measures, that can only get much worse, unfortunately.
Exactly. That's exactly the way it's going to go. And we need to work against this to try to tighten up some of these rules and regulations, get rid of the ones that are ineffective, inefficient. And if there's waste, fraud, and abuse, get rid of that also. But you don't shut down an entire agency, fire the people, and then say, well, now we'll look for the waste, fraud, and abuse. It's absolutely the wrong approach. But Dr. Phil Williams, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was a pleasure talking to you on this, and I hope perhaps we can do it again sometime.
We will do it. Thank you so much. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.